The sun was a hammer and the land was the anvil. It beat the dust into a fine, choking powder that clung to the inside of her throat. 5 of them stood on the raw lumber of the trading post platform, barefoot on the splintered wood. The heat came up through the soles of their feet, a slow, relentless cooking. They were a fence line of girls, all sharp angles and hollows, their dark hair matted with the grit of a long road. Their captor, a man named Silas whose sweat stained the collar of his shirt in dark half-moons, paced before them, his voice a greasy smear in the clean, dry air. She kept her eyes down. She had learned early that eyes were dangerous things. They could invite cruelty or, worse, a kind of pity that felt like being skinned alive. She focused instead on a single nail head in the plank beneath her feet, rusted to the color of old blood. It was an anchor in the swirling dust and the low, murmuring voices of the townspeople who had gathered. They were not a mob. They were worse. They were spectators, their curiosity as casual and sharp as a shard of glass. A horsefly buzzed, fat and lazy, near her ear. She did not flinch. To flinch was to show you were still alive enough to be tormented. The other girls stood in a similar state of rigid stillness, a family of statues carved from exhaustion. They had been taken from the riverlands, their world of cool green shade traded for this endless expanse of bleached brown. The crossing of the wire fence that marked the edge of the known world had been the first cut. Now their feet were raw, their spirits rubbed down to a thin, frayed thread. Silas grabbed the arm of the youngest girl, pulling her forward. The girl stumbled, her gasp a tiny, sharp sound, quickly swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. "Strong back," Silas announced, his voice booming with false heartiness. "Good for fieldwork, laundry." Barely used, he ran a hand down the girl's braid as if assessing livestock. The crowd shifted. A woman in a gray bonnet murmured something to her husband, who shook his head. They were not buying. They were watching a show that was beginning to lose its novelty. The sun baked down, leaching the energy from the scene, leaving only the grime and the quiet desperation. She felt a gaze on her, different from the others. It was not hungry or curious. It was heavy like a stone. Slowly, defying her own rule, she lifted her head, her eyes scanning the edge of the small crowd. He stood near the corner of the smithy, half hidden in the sharp line of shadow cast by the building. He was a man made of the same dust and sun as the land itself. His hat was low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the tired set of his jaw, the deep lines bracketing his mouth. He wore a coat that had seen too many winters and his boots were scuffed gray. He wasn't watching Silas, he was watching her. And in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a flat, weary recognition, as if he were looking at a reflection of a hurt he knew intimately. Silas, frustrated by the lack of interest, turned his attention to her. He strode over, his boot falls loud on the platform. He didn't grab her arm. He took a fistful of her hair and yanked her head back. "This one's got fire," he spat, more to himself than the crowd. Or she did. Quiet now. Teachable. Pain, sharp and bright, shot down her neck. Her eyes watered, but she refused to make a sound. She met the man's gaze in the shadow. He did not move, but something in his stillness changed. The air around him seemed to grow denser, colder. He had carried whole winters in his eyes, and for a moment, she felt the frost. He pushed off from the wall. He did not stride or hurry. He walked with a deliberation that drew every eye. The murmurings of the crowd died, replaced by a waiting silence. He stopped before the platform, his gaze still locked on her, ignoring Silas completely. Silas let go of her hair. He straightened up, puffing out his chest, a bantam rooster sensing a rival. "Something I can help you with, Ethan?" His voice was laced with a mocking familiarity. The man, Ethan, finally shifted his gaze to Silas. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He didn't open it. He just held it. The gesture was enough. "I've got a debt with you, Silas," Ethan said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding under a river. It was not the voice of a man used to speaking. Silas's eyes flickered to the pouch, then back to Ethan's face. A slow, greedy smile spread across his lips. "That you do, Ethan. That you do. Long overdue." "This clear it?" Ethan asked. He tossed the pouch. It landed on the platform with a dull, heavy thud. The sound was final. Silas bent to snatch it, his eagerness plain. He hefted it, his smile widening. "This will do just fine." He looked from the pouch to the line of girls. "Take your pick, though I'd recommend the little one. Less trouble." Ethan did not look at the other girls. His eyes found her again. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture so minimal it was almost not there at all. "That one." He said it as if he were claiming a stray dog. There was no kindness in it, only a grim transaction. And yet, it was the first time all day she had felt like a single entity, not just one of a huddled group. She was that one. Silas shrugged, his business concluded. "Your funeral. She's half wild." Ethan ignored him. He stepped onto the platform, his presence sucking the air out of the space. He pulled a small, worn clasp knife from his pocket. The blade clicked open, a small, sharp sound in the sudden quiet. He moved behind her and, with a single, fluid motion, sawed through the coarse rope binding her wrists. The fibers parted. The rope fell away. Her hands, suddenly free, felt unervingly light. She rubbed her wrists, the skin red and raw beneath. She did not look at him. She looked at her feet, at the wood, at the dust. He turned and stepped off the platform without a word. He did not offer a hand. He did not wait to see if she would follow. He simply started walking away from the trading post, toward a lone wagon hitched at the edge of the sparse settlement. For a long moment, she remained frozen. The murmurs of the crowd started again, this time laced with confusion. She could feel the stares of the other girls on her back, a mixture of envy and fear. Silas was already trying to sell the next one. The world she knew, the one of shared misery, was already moving on without her. She took a breath. The air still tasted of dust, but it felt different. She stepped off the platform. Her bare feet met the hot, soft dirt of the road. She looked at the back of the man walking away from her, a steady, solitary figure moving toward the vast, empty horizon. She began to follow. The journey was a silent covenant. The wagon creaked, a rhythmic complaint against the weight of the meager supplies he'd bought. She walked behind it, her feet finding a rhythm in the twin ruts carved into the earth. The dust lifted behind them like fading ghosts. He never looked back to see if she was there, but he set a pace a walker could match, not one for a horse alone. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky, a relentless eye. The landscape was a canvas of browns and pale yellows, broken only by the gray-green of stubborn scrub. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. It was a place that had no love for soft things. When the sun was at its highest, blistering and white, he stopped the wagon. He climbed down and reached for a canteen hanging from the seat. He walked back to her. He did not speak, just held it out. His knuckles were cracked, the skin weathered like old leather. She took it, her hand brushing his for a fraction of a second. His skin was warm from the sun, solid. She drank, the water tasting of metal and mercy. It was the first act of direct kindness, and it sat in her chest, heavy and strange. She handed it back. He nodded once, took a swallow himself, and returned to the wagon. The journey resumed. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and blood orange across the western sky. The house was not a home. It was a shelter, a structure hunkered down against the wind, its wood weathered to the color of bone. It was square and plain, with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged slightly to one side. A single lamp glowed with a weak, yellow light in one window. Behind the house, on a small, wind-swept hill, a solitary wooden cross stood stark against the fading light. The place was an extension of the man himself, isolated, functional, and haunted by a silence that was more than just an absence of noise. He led the horse to a small barn, its roof patched with tin. She stood by the porch, not knowing what to do, where to stand. She was a foreign object dropped into this landscape of solitude. The wind picked up, thin and mean, and she wrapped her arms around herself. He emerged from the barn and walked toward the house. He stopped at the porch steps and looked at her. "You can come in," he said. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact. The inside was spare. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the main room. A door to the left was closed. A door to the right stood slightly ajar. The air smelled of wood smoke, old wool, and something else. A faint, lingering scent of dried lavender, a ghost of a memory. He gestured with his chin toward the open door. "That room's yours," he said. Beds made, he walked to the fireplace, where a pot sat on a hook over the embers. He ladled a thick, dark stew into a wooden bowl and set it on the table. He did not set a place for himself. He took a piece of bread from a cloth-wrapped bundle and stood by the hearth, eating it slowly. She crept to the doorway of the room he had indicated. It was small, containing only a narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket and a small, high window that looked out onto the vast, dark plain. There was no lock on the door. She turned back. He was watching her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "I don't lock doors," he said, as if answering a question she hadn't dared to form. He finished his bread, wiped his hands on his trousers, and moved toward the closed door on the other side of the room. "The food's there. Eat it or don't." He disappeared into the other room, closing the door softly behind him. She was alone. The silence of the house settled around her, a heavy blanket. It was different from the silence of the road. This silence had shape and weight. It had history. She looked at the bowl of stew on the table. Steam rose from it in a thin, wavering line. She was property no longer, but what she was now, she did not know. She walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and began to eat. The stew was hot, and it burned a trail of warmth all the way down to her hollow stomach. The days fell into a rhythm, as stark and unadorned as the landscape. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet, practiced. She would wake to the smell of coffee and the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards. He would be gone when she emerged, out to the far-flung fences or into the dry pastures where his few hardy cattle roamed. She began to claim the house in small, silent ways. She swept the floors not because she was told, but because the dust felt like an intrusion. She learned the particular creak of each floorboard. She washed the 2 bowls, the 2 spoons, the single pot, and set them by the hearth to dry. She did not touch the closed door to his room, nor did she venture into the room that smelled of lavender, a space that felt sealed by more than just wood and hinges. It was a room holding its breath. They rarely spoke. Words were expensive things in this place, to be used only when absolutely necessary. Their communication was a language of objects. A bucket of clean water left by the door was a question. The empty bucket returned to its spot was the answer. A stack of neatly mended clothes on his chair was a statement. An extra piece of jerky left on the table was a reply. She watched him from the small window in her room. She watched him mend a broken fence post, his movements economical and strong. She watched him stand on the hill by the wooden cross for a long time as the sun went down. His hat in his hands, his shoulders slumped just so. She saw that his grief was a physical thing, a coat he could not take off. One afternoon, while searching for kindling near the base of the hill, she found a small, stubborn patch of wildflowers. Their purple heads bowed against the wind. They were tough, wiry things, survivors. On impulse, she picked a single blossom. She climbed the low hill, her bare feet sure on the dry, packed earth. The grave was marked with a simple name carved into the wood. Anna. She hesitated, feeling like a trespasser. Then, she gently laid the small purple flower at the base of the cross. When he came in that evening, he did not mention it. But as he sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, she saw his eyes drift toward the window that faced the hill. He paused his work for a moment, his hands still. The silence in the room shifted. It was still vast, but a small, warm current now moved within it. She began to hum. It was not a song, just a low, tuneless sound she made in the back of her throat as she worked, a sound from a life she could barely remember. The first time she did it, he stopped what he was doing, listening. He did not tell her to be quiet. He simply went back to his task, and the small sound became a part of the house, like the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. He bought her a pair of sturdy shoes in town, leaving them by her door without a word. They were ugly and practical, but when she put them on, they fit. He brought back a bolt of rough, brown cloth, and she spent the evenings by the fire, stitching herself a new dress, the repetitive motion of the needle a soothing balm. They worked in parallel, two solitary planets orbiting the same small star of the hearth fire, a silent understanding building between them like a patient coral reef. One evening he tried to bake bread. The resulting loaf was a disaster, a dense, blackened lump that could have served as a doorstop. He pulled it from the small oven, looked at it with disgust, and set it on the table. "That loaf died in vain," she said, her voice quiet. He looked at her, startled. It was the first full sentence she had offered without being asked a direct question. A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed his face before it was gone. "A little dry," he admitted, his own voice laced with a dry irony that met hers in the space between them. "You didn't complain about mine," she countered, her gaze dropping back to her sewing. He grunted, a sound that was almost a laugh. He broke off a piece of the terrible bread, chewed it thoughtfully, and then threw the rest into the fire. The flames hissed and spat. The tension did not break, but it changed its shape, becoming something pliable, something almost comfortable. The nights were the hardest. The wind would howl around the corners of the house, a lonely, predatory sound. It scraped at the walls, searching for a way in. On those nights, the memories came for her, sharp-edged and suffocating. She would wake with a gasp, the feel of Silas's hand in her hair, the smell of the dusty trading post in her nostrils. One night, a scream clawed its way out of her throat before she could stifle it. It was a small, strangled sound, but in the profound silence of the house, it was a thunderclap. She sat bolt upright, trembling, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. The darkness in her room felt absolute, pressing in on her. Footsteps sounded in the main room, slow and heavy. They stopped outside her door. She held her breath, every muscle tensed. She expected the door to open, expected an angry voice, an intrusion, but there was nothing. Only the sound of his presence on the other side of the thin wooden door, a solid, unmoving weight. He was just standing there, a sentinel. She didn't know how long he stood there. Long enough for the frantic beating of her heart to slow. Long enough for the trembling in her limbs to subside. Long enough for the pressing darkness to recede to the corners of the room. He was a barrier between her and the howling emptiness of the night. When her breathing had returned to a steady, quiet rhythm, she heard his footsteps retreat, as softly as they had come. The next evening they sat by the fire as usual. The air was thick with the unspoken event of the previous night. He stared into the flames, turning a piece of wood over and over in his hands. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The word hung in the air between them. It was a question she had carried since the trading post. "Why me? Why save me?" He did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the fire. The light danced across the rugged landscape of his face, making valleys of the lines there. "My wife, Anna," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "She was kind, to a fault. She believed you could mend anything if you were just patient enough." He paused, the silence stretching. "She died trying to pull a calf from a freezing river. The cow survived." He finally turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were not filled with winter now, but with a deep, aching void. "I owed her a kindness," he said softly, "and I saw him put his hands on you, and I just couldn't." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. In that moment she understood. He had not saved her for her sake. He had saved her for his. He was trying to mend a hole in his own world, stitching it together with this one act of raw, clumsy decency. She was a debt being paid to a ghost. Strangely, it did not diminish the act. It made it more real, more human. He was not a saint or a savior. He was a man, as broken as she was, trying to find a way to keep living. She reached out and put a small piece of wood on the fire. A gesture, an acknowledgement. They sat in the shared quiet, the firelight warming their faces, two shipwrecked souls who had found the same desolate shore. The foundation of trust settled between them, not built on words, but on shared wounds and the quiet promise of a vigil kept outside a door in the dead of night. The first harbinger of the past came not as a rider, but as a change in the wind. A season had turned. The brutal heat of summer had softened into the crisp, golden light of autumn. The routine on the small ranch was so established it felt as if it had always been. She had a name now, one she had finally offered him one evening by the fire. Lena. He had said it once, tasting the shape of it, and then nodded, accepting it as fact. Lena. It was the first time it had sounded like her own. But one afternoon, as Ethan was riding the southern fence line, he saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the vast sky, moving slow and deliberate. They were too far to make out faces, but they were not neighbors. Neighbors kept to the roads. These men cut straight across the open prairie, heading directly for his land. A cold knot tightened in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that the peace was over. He turned his horse and rode hard for the house, the beat of the hooves a frantic counterpoint to the steady calm he forced upon his face. Lena was outside, hanging washed clothes on a line she had strung between the porch and a sturdy post. She saw him coming, saw the urgency in the way he rode, and her hands stilled on a white shirt. The cloth flapped in the breeze, a frantic signal. She knew, too. The fear was an old acquaintance, and it settled back into her bones as if it had never left. He reined his horse in, sliding to a stop in a cloud of dust. He didn't waste words. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and tight. "Stay there." She didn't argue. She gathered the laundry basket, her movements jerky, and hurried into the house. She shut the door but did not latch it. She went to the window, peering through the small, wavy pane of glass. Ethan dismounted but did not tie up his horse. He stood by the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He was a statue of waiting defiance. The house, their fragile sanctuary, was now a fortress, and he was its lone guard. The riders drew closer. The middle one was Silas, his familiar, swaggering posture unmistakable even from a distance. The other 2 were hired muscle, men with hard, empty faces. They rode onto his land as if they owned it, pulling up a few yards from the porch. The air grew thick, charged with imminent violence. Silas smirked, his gaze sweeping over the small, tidy homestead with contempt. Well, Ethan. Playing house, are we?" His eyes flickered to the door of the cabin. "I'm here for my property. The contract was for indenture, not purchase." She ran. "I'm taking her back." His argument was a thin veneer of legality over simple, brutal greed. He saw her not as a person, but as a lost tool he had come to retrieve. Ethan did not move. He stood between Silas and the house, a quiet, immovable object. His voice, when it came, was flat and cold as river stone. "She's not property." "Oh, she is," Silas sneered, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "And the law says she's mine. Now you can step aside or you can get hurt. Makes no difference to me." One of Silas's men began to dismount, a clear threat. "This is my land," Ethan said, his voice still dangerously quiet. He raised the rifle slightly, the gesture economical, final. "And she is under my protection. You are not welcome here. Turn around." From inside, Lena watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the standoff, the simple, brutal math of it. 3 against 1. She saw the way Ethan stood, his feet planted, ready to die on this small patch of dirt for a kindness he owed a ghost. And something inside her, Something that had been dormant and frozen for years finally broke free. It was not courage. It was rage. A pure, clean fire that burned away the last of her fear. Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Protection? An old man and his grief? That's not protection. That's a eulogy. He took a step forward. I'm taking what's mine. The cabin door creaked open. All four men turned. Lena stood in the doorway. She was no longer the hunched, frightened creature from the trading post. She stood tall, her bare feet planted on the threshold. In her hands, she held the heavy, cast-iron skillet, gripped like a weapon. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Silas's smirk faltered. He had come expecting a cowering girl he could drag away. He was not prepared for this woman. "No," Lena said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a shard of ice. It was the voice of a person who had reclaimed her own name. Silas stared at her, then back at Ethan. He saw not a broken old man and a runaway girl. He saw a unified front. He saw two people who had nothing left to lose and had, somehow, found everything to defend. The odds were still in his favor, but the certainty was gone. This would be messy. This would be costly. He hesitated, and in that hesitation he lost. His bluster was a fragile thing, built on the assumption of his victim's powerlessness. Faced with unyielding defiance, it crumbled. "This ain't over," he spat, the words hollow. He gestured angrily at his men. He turned his horse, kicking it viciously, and galloped away, his hired guns following in his wake. They did not look back. The dust they kicked up hung in the air for a long time before settling back to the earth. Lena and Ethan stood frozen in the aftermath, the silence ringing in their ears. The skillet in her hands felt impossibly heavy. Her arms began to tremble. Ethan slowly lowered his rifle. He walked to the porch and sat down heavily on the top step, the strength seeming to drain out of him all at once. He looked up at her, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice thin. "I know," she whispered. The skillet slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the wooden planks of the porch. The sound broke the spell. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, the void in his eyes was filled with something other than grief. It was awe. "You didn't run." She shook her head, a small, jerky motion. She sank to her knees on the porch, the rough wood pressing into her skin. She had not run. She had stood. She had found her voice and her ground on this small, lonely patch of earth. She had not been saved. She had saved herself. And in doing so, she had saved him, too. The house behind them was no longer just a shelter. It was home. That night, the fire in the hearth burned brighter. The unspoken thing that had been forged in the crucible of the confrontation settled into the bones of the house. The threat had been repelled, not just by a man with a rifle, but by a woman with a skillet and a single powerful word. Later, when the moon was high, Ethan took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one she had kept bundled in a corner of her room like a relic of a past life. He carried it outside without a word. Lena followed him. He walked to a small, cleared patch of dirt away from the house and laid the dress down. He struck a match. The dry cotton caught quickly, the flames a hungry orange against the deep blue of the night. They stood together and watched it burn. They watched the shape of her old life, the fabric of her humiliation, turn to black ash and smoke that curled up into the indifferent stars. It was a funeral. It was a baptism. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. When only glowing embers remained, he turned to her. The firelight flickered in his eyes. "Lena," he said, her name a solid thing in the quiet dark. "I'm not. I can't be him." He gestured vaguely toward the hill where Anna lay. "But I don't want to be alone anymore." It was the most vulnerable he had ever been. His heart laid bare in the simple, clumsy words. "I know," she said, and she did. He was not replacing a ghost. He was choosing to live among the living. In the weeks that followed, the house began to breathe again. She opened the door to the room that had smelled of lavender. It was plain, like the others, holding only a sewing table and a rocking chair. She did not remove Anna's things. She simply aired out the room, letting the fresh, dry wind chase out the stale memories. She placed a jar with a few late-season wildflowers on the sill. It was not an erasure. It was an expansion. The house was big enough for two histories. One day, the circuit preacher came through, a tired man on a tired horse. Ethan spoke to him quietly on the porch. The next morning, with the rising sun as their witness and the wind as their congregation, they were married. There were no flowers, no fine clothes. It was a simple, stark ceremony, an exchange of promises as practical and solid as the earth beneath their feet. It was not about passion. It was about partnership. It was a formal declaration of the fortress they had already built. Life settled into a new kind of routine, one of work and shared meals and long, comfortable silences. The ghosts were still there. The cross on the hill, the phantom feel of rope on her wrists, but they no longer haunted the present. They were just part of the landscape, like the rocks and the scrub and the endless sky. The final image of their beginning was not a grand gesture. It was a quiet evening on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the harsh land in strokes of soft pink and gentle gold. Ethan sat in his usual chair, mending a piece of leather tack. Lena sat on the steps, her back against a post, shelling beans into a large wooden bowl, the soft thud of them hitting the wood a peaceful, rhythmic sound. He finished his work and set the tack aside. He watched her for a moment, her dark hair catching the last of the light. He reached out, not to touch her face or her hand, but to gently brush a stray piece of chaff from her sleeve. It was a small, unconscious gesture of care, a piece of their silent language made manifest. She looked up and their eyes met. She offered him a small, genuine smile. It was the first one he had ever seen from her, and it transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He smiled back, a slow, unpracticed thing that creased the corners of his eyes. The house behind them was warm with the smell of baking bread. A good loaf this time. It was no longer a hollow shelter against the wind. It was full. It was theirs. They sat together in the fading light, two broken pieces that had, against all odds, made a whole, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It's about how real sanctuaries aren't built from wood and stone, but from the quiet, unspoken promises between two people. It's about how safety isn't always a lock on a door, but the presence of someone who will stand guard on the other side of it, just by being there. The world is full of takers, people who will try to name you, to define you by your scars, to call you property or broken or less. They will hand you a story of who you are, written in the ink of their own greed and cruelty. But the truth is, your name is your own until you give it away. And your story is your own, waiting to be written. The real act of healing isn't being saved. It's the terrifying, beautiful moment you decide to save yourself. It's raising the skillet. It's finding your voice, even if it only says one word. So here is your naming. You are not your wounds. You are the resilience that grew around them. And if you are brave enough to stand on your own ground, you might just find you are not standing there alone. You might find that the person standing with you isn't a savior, but a fellow survivor. And together, in that shared, silent understanding, you can build a home in the most desolate of places. You can make the desert bloom.